This is Scott Richmond.
And Arnie Sherman.
You're listening to What Do You Know on Newstalk KGVO, AM 1290 and 98.3 FM. Top of the morning to you, Arnie O. Sherman. How are you?
Scott O. Richmond, I'm doing great.
Well,
we have a really fascinating guest here. I'm very excited to have him on. Jim Harmon, who for 50 years worked as a radio TV broadcaster to 2010, retired, and for the last few years has been writing for the Missoula Current a column called Harmon's Histories, where he goes back and researches contemporary issues and their roots in Montana's past, like opioid use, like, when radio first started here, how the slant streets and the regular streets first emerged. Fascinating guy, and he has a lot to share with us. So I'm looking forward to getting him on right now.
I agree with you, Arnie. He's our resident historian.
Yes.
Right?
Resident historian and resident journalist. Because he does the work.
He does the work that nobody is doing these days.
I mean, when was the last time you went to the library and looked at microfilm? He does this, regularly.
Back when I was in college at the Library of Congress.
Right. So I'm happy to have him on the show, and I have this feeling that we may be using him again in the future as an authoritative resource on contemporary issues.
Yeah, he has a lot of good information to share. Back after this with Jim Harmon. This is Scott Richmond.
And Arnie Sherman.
You're listening to What Do You Know on Newstalk KGVO, AM 1290 and 98.3 FM. These guys are laughing here. We have Jim Harmon.
We're already reminiscing.
This is your
microphone.
This guy's not a stranger to a microphone either.
No, Jim Harmon, it's good to have you on the show.
Hi, Jim.
As he was just pointing out, we're laughing, not a 50-year career, a 49-year career in radio and TV broadcasting.
Well, we have to specify with specificity.
Well, in this era of fake news, who cares? You could say 150-year career. Facts are not relevant anymore.
What frighteningly true.
I know.
But what's so nice about Jim is that what brought Jim to us was an article. That's what brought you to our attention. Although I'm a 5-year veteran of Missoula, he's been here for 20 years, but. You've been here for how many years? And you were a broadcast journalist for 49 years.
For about 30 years in Missoula.
Okay.
I was born and raised up in Libby.
Okay.
I'm a logger.
Okay.
Right.
And after high school, I had to get the heck out of Montana. Who wants to stay in this place that has no job opportunities?
No internet.
In this field.
Right.
I mean,
did they even have radio back then?
Well, they had radio. Yeah.
But not many stations.
No. I learned about radio at night because all those 50,000-watt stations from San Francisco and Salt Lake City and Albuquerque, all those came in at night. During the day, nothing.
Is that right?
Oh, absolutely.
We're taping this show, with Jim Harmon. I'm going to bring Tom in to meet him.
Yeah.
Tom McGinley is my chief engineer. Does that name ring a bell at all?
Maybe.
He was born and bred here or in Montana and is a veteran of broadcasting, spent a lot of time out in Seattle, and then came back here 3 years ago to retire. He had a house here, and he's going to know you. He's going to know who you are, and he's going to want to talk to you. But we'll bring him in maybe for our last segment.
Okay.
But you were mentioning, we asked.
Well, how did Jim come to our attention?
Right. Yes.
It was through the Missoula Current.
Right. And in his series called Harmon's Histories, and I'm always fascinated by someone who has the fortitude to go back and read all of this history of Missoula and come up with interesting articles that are related to what's happening now. For example, the issue that you focused on paying for streets. And people are concerned about paying for streets, but we started that in the 1800s here.
Oh, my goodness, yes. Originally, the whole road issue was fascinating in Montana. There was no money in the territory. Even when we finally became a state in the late 1880s, 89, there still wasn't any money.
There still isn't much now either.
So there was much talk at the time about toll roads. And that was about the only way you could create a road was by a toll road. Famously, the one that went over the pass toward Helena, that was a toll road. And in fact, the operators of that road conducted a bar and a restaurant and an overnight stay for folks heading that direction.
To get when you were on that toll road.
Absolutely. But the problem was these people who ran the toll roads weren't exactly, a public servant. They were doing it for the money. So they'd get a contract to do a toll road, and they'd promise to maintain it. Well, that particular road wasn't well maintained at all. It was all about the money.
Right.
And so eventually the state, the territory and then the state decided toll roads maybe are not such a great idea.
Right.
So specifically around Missoula, the county commissioners moved toward road districts and actually having a series of road supervisors. And so that's sort of how things evolved. And then sooner than later in Montana history, it was decided we're never going back to toll roads.
Right.
And it's interesting in the contemporary conversations of the last year or two, that issue of toll roads, federally anyway, has come up again.
Sure.
And have we learned nothing from history?
And your column helps me with things like, why do we have slant streets in the middle of rectangular streets?
Absolutely. Well, it's two different people designing two different parts of the city.
That didn't like each other.
And they didn't like each other at all. One aligning toward, Jumbo, one aligning toward Sentinel, and there you have the slant street.
And then we have an article about, there's all this discussion about opioid use and meth and all that, and all of a sudden
that was fascinating.
There's an article about 1890s when we had basically an opium epidemic here in Montana.
It was an opium epidemic, but it was somewhat hidden. I have looked and looked for any real books delving into this issue, and it isn't there. As I alluded to in the article in the Current, I wish that reporter for the Weekly Missoulian back in the 1890s had actually done the work and written a thorough history of opium dens in Missoula specifically.
Well, you would have to think that it came about through the Chinese rail workers that were coming here.
It was, and you also have to directly tie the opium use, the drug use of the period, with the incredible prejudice against the Chinese at the time.
Right.
From the very first newspaper in Missoula, which was not the Missoulian, it was the Missoula and Cedar Creek Pioneer. It published its first issue September 15th, 1870. Now, that's only a handful of years after Missoula existed. We don't have an exact birth date for Missoula. It was in 64 or 65 circa.
Right at the end of the Civil War, Missoula
exactly.
Was it a weekly? What was the
It was a weekly.
Okay.
And it was, do you know Cedar Creek, by the way?
Yes. No, what is Cedar? I don't know what Cedar Creek is.
It's a spa up the street of Cedar Creek.
Oh, yeah, no, I know that.
No.
Where is it?
Arnie, come on. It actually is the Superior area.
Okay. Huh.
Why? The mines were out there.
Okay.
They discovered gold.
Wow.
It was part of the gold rush, and it was part of what made Missoula, Missoula. Otherwise, it would have been this little sleepy agricultural town, you know the name, Garden City.
Right.
That all related to Missoula and the Bitterroot Valley being such a fertile growing region.
Okay.
Supplying the foods necessary for all these hungry, folks in early day Montana.
Why your curiosity and
Yes.
why your
He's
interest
the historian.
and your passion for digging up these historical nuggets?
That came as a result of retirement.
Mm-hmm.
When did you retire, Jim?
I retired 8 years ago on my birthday, August 12 of, what the heck year was it? 2010.
2010.
Because we're now at 19, right?
And where did you retire from?
I retired from working at KECI TV.
NBC,
and I'd been there right around 30-ish years. Before that, I'd been in radio for 20 years.
I can tell.
Thank you.
Well, radio, not here in Missoula, in another...
Oh, no. I started as a 14-year-old at KLCB, 1230 on your dial, Libby, Montana, which only broadcast in the morning for a few hours.
Right.
They took an afternoon hiatus. As a 14-year-old, I had to look up the word hiatus to find out what in the world that meant.
Right.
It meant they signed off the air so that the only announcer, owner of the station, salesman could go downtown to sell the ads and collect a few bits of news from the county courthouse and then sign the station on again at 4:30 in the afternoon.
This is a whole conversation around how history informs the present.
Right.
Okay. Same thing now with radio.
Yeah.
We're not broadcasting. We're selling, and we have to take. It's great.
You even did a story early on as part of Harmon's Histories about who first brought radio to Montana.
Oh, absolutely. I didn't delve into necessarily a little sidebar on the first radio station in Montana because it wasn't here.
Right.
It was Great Falls, I believe. But I was curious about what the first radio station in Missoula was, and it turned out that actually if you considered the Bitterroot part of Missoula, which, by the way, it was. I keep zipping back in history.
Right.
Missoula County originally was all the way from, my hometown of Libby down through all of Flathead, Sanders, through Missoula, and the Bitterroot.
Wow.
All of Ravalli County. Ravalli and Flathead only became counties in 1893. Splitting off from Missoula. But anyway, what was the question? You see,
First radio
station
was a fella and his son in Stevensville who created, they were fascinated by radio.
What year was this about?
Oh my gosh, you see, that's why I
computer
brought my computer and notes.
Right.
But, the early 20th century.
Right.
This fellow was in agriculture. Orchards, various things. He would take a trip to California in the off season, in the winter time. He went there to learn about new agricultural techniques, growing techniques, etc. But he would also kind of soak up the latest from the big cities. Radio had, just come into being, and he was absolutely fascinated with it. But more so, his son was absolutely bitten by it. Right. The two of them put together from little parts they mail ordered in and brought in and put together a radio station. So the Stevensville station was the first one here in the valley, in western Montana.
Wow.
The university within months created its first radio station.
Okay.
And that was a professor who had been brought in somewhere back east, I believe, and he and his students put together a radio station. Both those stations in Stevensville and at the university folded within a few years.
Just to put this in the proper context, the first radio station in the United States was in Pittsburgh.
Right.
KDKA, right.
And began broadcasting in 1921. So look how far we've come. We're 98 years from just when the first radio hit, and look what technology has changed in 100 years, considering the thousands of years before that to get to radio.
Oh, yeah. But the nice thing is that radio is still radio. Like, no matter how you consume it, whether it's through your smartphone, through your computer, or through your car, or through your radio in your home, that's still the same product.
Yes.
Radio is same, it will, knock on wood, it will never die because it's available.
In some form or another.
In some form or another, audio and information and entertainment through a variety of devices will continue to thrive because the theater of the mind.
Exactly.
The theater of the mind, which is what you create with your your articles in the Current, you're creating a setting. You're telling a story. Absolutely. It does lend itself nicely to radio, and you should. That's why I think we have you on today.
Yeah. So one of my questions when we knew you were coming on,
yes,
is as you have done your research, who are some of the forgotten heroes and characters of Missoula of old? Are there some that pop out that we may not be familiar with, but were sort of seminal to the development of our community?
Is there a Rip Van Winkle of Missoula?
Not in the vein you're talking.
Right.
Again, we have to go back to why I did this in the first place.
Sure. Yeah, why?
I retired.
Right.
And I had nothing to do other than my favorite hobby of landscape gardening on my couple of acres in the Bitterroot. And but what do I do in the wintertime? I can't garden. So I thought I'm going to go to the library and kind of search around some of the old microfilm, and maybe
because you can't find this you can't just Google this. It's not going to come up.
No, although we can talk about that. More and more of it is being digitized and made available to the public. But at that time, 8 years ago, very little of Missoula was available to you. So I went into the research area of the city library and decided I'm going to pull out a microfilm, and I had no idea what I was looking for. The very first one I pulled out and put in the machine and brought up the very first image. Here on the front page, in fact, I brought it along for you to look at. I printed it out earlier today. There it is. There's the headline. Read that headline.
Turkey racket. Causing heaps of anxiety in certain circles. Prominent men implicated in the swiping of the toothsome Turk for which Shaney kids now languish.
No. This story is on the front page of the newspaper, okay? A turkey theft.
Oh, yeah, it's unbelievable.
And,
Heaps of anxiety.
And I'm saying to myself, what? I've got to read this story.
It must have been a slow news day, Jim.
It could have been. But the fella, now we don't know exactly who wrote that story because they didn't do bylines until the early part of the 20th century. So there were no bylines.
Right.
I'm assuming after all my research that it was Lambert Molinini. Now, or Molinelli, I'm sorry. He was the editor / publisher of the newspaper at that time. And this was January 2nd, 1894.
Wow. Okay.
So
that's before Montana's a state.
Absolutely.
But I want to know who the prominent men implicated are in that turkey theft.
That started my search. Here is this fascinating item.
Right.
I do these asides. I hated history in school. You couldn't make me like a history class. Names, dates, events, places. I mean,
Magna Carta. Who cares?
Yeah, really. That was my view of history. Now, all of a sudden, here's some history that's fascinating. Well, it turns out there are a group of prominent individuals in the town of Missoula at the time, 1893, who are members of a fraternal organization. I'm not sure which one. It was never made clear in the articles, but I think it was Knights of Pythias, I believe.
Those damn Knights of Pythias.
Absolutely.
Again.
It could have been linked to the Masons, but I've never really nailed it down. They called themselves the Hidges, Hijis, Hidges. I've looked it up. I've done research.
What does that mean?
I can't find it anywhere.
I don't like the sound of it.
No.
I don't like
okay, so here
Once the Hidges get after you, you're in real trouble.
So here are the most prominent people of Missoula. including people like Dr. H.H. Henson, medical doctor, etc.
He lives near us, Arnie. Well, the family does.
Yeah, the family, the Henson Ranch.
Right. So you have these prominent people. They're part of a lodge, a fraternity, and just for fun, pranks, giggles, whatever, they now and then steal a chicken or steal a turkey. And they think it's great fun. So this has been going on, apparently, from the newspaper articles for years. Finally, someone steals Mr. Skinner's turkey. Now, back then, of course, you didn't have all the refrigeration and everything, so you'd go buy the turkey, and you'd hang it up on your deck or outside a windowsill or something in the night, and you're going to roast it the next day. So these prominent Missoulians, they don't want to do it themselves because that'd make a bad headline here. So they get the Sheeny Kid, a local barfly.
Yes.
They pay him a few bucks, and it's like, hey, go get that turkey for us. And then we'll take it down. We'll take it down and roast it.
You can get strung up for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll take it down to the local, eatery and have them cook it up for us. But this is where it really gets crazy because the Sheeny Kid can't quite get it up at that height on the overhanging on a balcony. And so he goes down to the fire department. And he tells them that,
I need to get this.
Dr. Parsons and Hanson and others have told me to get this turkey. Can you give me one of those hooks? He gets one from the fire department.
Well, it's not really smart because he's going to steal something and he goes to the fire
and he tells the fire department about that.
Well, then he's not that smart.
No, he's drunk.
He's a barfly.
He went to the barfly, of
course.
course.
He's the barfly. So he goes down and he actually uses this thing, gets the turkey, only Mr. Sheeny sees him. Aha! And, gives chase. So as it all wraps up, Sheeny catches him. He wants to press charges, has the Sheeny Kid arrested. But the prominent folks really don't want this to happen. So they sort of on the side say, hey, we'll pay you for the value of the turkey.
Right. No hassle.
Just forget about this. The trouble is they promised to do that, and so the Sheeny Kid is released. Only they don't follow through. They don't pay. So the owner of the turkey has the Sheeny Kid rearrested, thrown in jail, and there's going to be a trial now because these prominent people promised to pay, and they didn't. So this is
the first story pull up.
This is
the whole movie. This is a TV series.
So you want to know how you can get hooked on history? There it is. Turkey racket.
Let me ask you a question. So you retire in 2010. At KECI, what did you do? News, weather. Tell us, what was your role there?
I was brought in. I was hired by Steve Fettfight.
Yes.
Who just retired recently.
Right.
Steve brought me in as the assistant news director, reporter, anchor, weather guy, and producer. All those things.
You wore many hats. By the way, our guest is Jim Harmon, writer, broadcaster, writing for the Missoula Current currently. Okay, so you retire 2010. You had spent a storied career both in radio and in TV broadcast at KECI, where you did everything in the news department. Steve Fettfight, most recently retired, hires you. So when you retire, you're like, I need something to do. I'm looking for something to do.
Besides gardening,
which you love to do, but you can't get away from.
I tried
the media.
You try that. I'll guarantee in retirement, the first thing you're going to do, I'm not going to turn on a television. I'm going to end my subscription to the newspapers. I don't want to hear it anymore. I don't want to be part of this anymore. 2 months.
2 months. Yeah. Okay. Now, let's fast forward. And what's so interesting about this, what attracted me to call Jim was looking at the article, How the History Informs the Present. nothing changes, right?
No.
It's just technology. The technology has changed.
Oh, that same story today is it just says Trump, lambasts his own policy advisors and says they're naive.
Right.
I know everything.
Michael Cohen is Sheeny Kid.
Yeah, that's Michael. Yeah, will you go get that turkey for me, please? What turkey? I've never.
And then after he gets a turkey for you, like, I didn't tell him to get the turkey.
And that guy doesn't even work for me.
But no, that's actually where I'm leading to, which is, are you surprised that, first of all, how do you feel? This is not talking about politics. I just want you to know how you feel when someone attacks media and says, and tries to discredit media, because I know that that's also not a new thing. That's something that's been going on since the media was the media.
Well, there's a word called muckraking, right?
Right.
Muckraking journalists.
Absolutely.
And so how does, again, the history inform the present?
Well, that's a never-ending question.
Right.
My mind is just,
Give us
doing all sorts of
the
movement.
top of the mind answer. What are you thinking?
You have to think back to the period we're talking about, the 1800s.
Right.
What you see today is kind of the landscape of that period. The Missoulian, in its salutatory message as it started its first issue, openly said, "We are against the Chinese, that they would take any job from able-bodied white Americans."
That's awesome.
Right.
Yes.
Now, that's paraphrasing, but pretty darn close to the exact words used. They put right on their front page in their opening statement upon embarking into the newspaper what their politics were, what their position was, while at the same time saying, but we're open to every other possible opinion and we will be fair and whatever.
Fair and balanced.
Absolutely. But they stated their position right up front.
Yeah.
Today, that's not done. Now, let's
it's not done, but it's understood.
Put it into the framework of my career.
Right.
That's from the 60s on to 2010, a 50-year period. Right. You're just coming out of the Edward R. Murrow period.
You're in the Walter Cronkite
and the Walter Cronkite period. You're in an area in which, at least broadcast journalism, was independent. It was to be absolutely unbiased. Those are the rules
and that's why
I operated under.
So interesting when Edward R. Murrow went after Joe McCarthy.
Absolutely.
That was a historic event he challenged him because they were not supposed to.
In check. He kept it in check.
Right. And so it's those values under which I operated in my career. Those don't exist today.
What changed? So as a media student, right, a student of media for many years, what was the moment what changed everything? What were the series of events that happened that changed everything? Because I have an opinion about this, but I want to hear what you think.
Sure. Fairness and equal time. The fairness doctrine went away. When I was in Albuquerque at KOB in 1970 to 72 doing morning radio news, it was an election period. We had to keep a list, and every candidate, Senator Joe Montoya at the time I was covering, I had to write down, I gave 23 seconds to Joe Montoya today, and you'd have this running chart on a clipboard. If things got out of balance, I would, there was actually a third-party candidate, an Alianza candidate, I believe, at the time, and he was sort of a candidate, but he didn't care. I'd have to call him up repeatedly saying, listen, your time is not even close to this fellow's time. Please talk to me about anything. Right. I'll just say something. I'll put you on the air, because that was a requirement.
Right. And that's gone now.
That's all gone. The
doors open to bias.
The mandate for this program, a public affairs interview program.
But we're not even. I mean, we are, but we're not. Yeah. We have another way of doing that.
Right.
Well, that's important.
But that went away.
The other way of doing it, you could have somebody like Donald Trump, who, if you gave him no airtime, was tweeting away, and the tweets had millions and millions.
Well, the internet's the other part of it. Digitization of media. the ability for everybody to broadcast.
That's not covered by any kind of fairness doctrine. That's his personal communication.
So where else? So the fairness doctrine, the fact of the matter is, so that goes out the window. The ability for for people to broadcast themselves, which is what I'm talking about, which is anybody can broadcast through any device or medium. And then I think, and I remember learning this in journalism school, when the media started to cover the media, okay, when they made the news. That wasn't supposed to be. Right?
No, I was never supposed to be part of the story.
Right. You're never,
I was not a word used in any story I ever wrote.
And that's all we do now is the media is covering the media. Well, then Fox News got this, ABC got this, NBC, and they're all CNN got this.
And then there are personalities that started getting, like Geraldo Rivera and others like him.
That's the 80s.
Right, but I mean, it started...
Well, Joe Pine, actually.
Well, that was very early on. That was very limited. But when you got into, talk news, that all just kind of exploded because you had to fill a lot of airtime and you wanted to attract more listeners.
Bob
so you
Grant.
wanted to be, more controversial.
And, no offense to this particular station and its, characters on it.
Morning programming.
But, there you go. But in the era of Newt Gingrich and Rush Limbaugh, I sort of said things are changing and not for the better.
No, because we moved away from fact to opinion.
Right.
And it wasn't clarified, right?
Yes, and it was no longer, suddenly when you did the news, was it really news?
Right.
And I still have to ask that question to this day. And now the point you brought up, Scott, was about, this whole internet explosion and everyone can post stories, etc. And all of a sudden I find myself in a world in which, including my wife, will say, did you hear this and how can that be true? And I'm saying, well, wait, the pivotal question is, where did you hear that? What's your source? And by the time I dig down to the source of what anyone's saying, I'm questioning the source as being accurate.
Right.
But people don't invest the time to do that, and they're supposed to be able to trust the news program as being factual and accurate and balanced.
Well, you mentioned the important point, which is the news started covering the news.
The news, right.
I remember as a kid when I was, luckily forced in the New York City public school system to read the New York Times every day. Every story had a byline, and you knew who wrote it.
Exactly.
And in some cases, they were biased, but you knew their bias. I mean, even today on the opinion page, you have Maureen Dowd, or you have, other journalists that have a particular slant on things, and you understand that. You know it's going to be that way.
Right.
But even when it wasn't, there was somebody putting their name to what was being read. You ask now somebody who said that, who wrote that, they have no idea.
Right. Because now we have all these things on social media that simply accumulate news stories from all these sources and then put it onto their site as though they're the news.
Right.
Well, they're not.
And some of it, particularly when you have, Russian and other influences creating, fictitious sources for things, and the legitimate established media trying to compete with each other to maybe be the first out with a story. Even the best publications have to apologize every so often now,
right. Well,
because
look at
they've
the
jumped
BuzzFeed.
the gun.
Right.
Yeah, with BuzzFeed or with anything
Although
else.
BuzzFeed's not backing down from that story.
Right.
No, I know they're not back down.
They're not
but the New
backing
York
down.
Times had to back down just on several occasions. And you remember in the days of Watergate and others, they had to be really, triple sure of what they were putting out
their
there.
sources. Well, they still do that. I think any great journalist worth his salt or her salt is verifying and checking and getting confirmation 10 ways to Sunday.
Well, the worst thing you can do is get it wrong.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Your credibility's out the window.
But even when it's right, this is the first time in our lifetime where the President of the United States, if somebody says anything critical, they're a bum, they're a liar, it's fake, it's false, it's a terrible publication, they're going out of business. Lies and, just... No president ever did that before.
No, although we refer to the bully pulpit of the presidency. No president has bullied the media like this one.
The worst story was when Lyndon Johnson got mad because they talked about him pulling his dog's ears. Yeah. Remember that? Yeah. That way he got mad at the media.
Right.
Reporting that.
Right.
And, of course, Nixon holding up.
Let's just do a quick ID. Our guest is Jim Harmon. We are talking all things media, which is what I had hoped we would do. But what I do, the premise of the past informing the present is so true now, right? Because nothing's new, right? It's just some things have changed, but still the same issues and still the same scenarios.
But it's just so much more overwhelming in terms of the attack points.
Yeah.
I mean, they when Lincoln ran against Douglas, there was lots of muckraking, but you didn't hear it from 100 different sources at one time.
Right.
One to many with social media that amplifies it even more. So it's this proliferation.
It comes down to the individual being willing to put in the work. Now, you actually have to work to find the truth.
Right.
Yeah.
You didn't have to do that in many periods of our past. But today more than ever, because of social media, you have to say, what's the source? Check it out. Really educate yourself. And it's painfully true that most people don't have the time or the inclination to do that. But another point you've made is, and I said it at the beginning, I hated history, learning names and dates and places.
Right.
But unless you invest a little of your time to learn some history, you can't possibly have the right perspective on what's going on today. We've been here before, can be said about any topic you want to bring up.
Right.
We've been here before. Didn't we learn something? Well, in many cases, no.
Do you feel... Arnie, sorry.
I was going to just say, I remember back in the era, of like Walter Cronkite. When Walter Cronkite said something, everybody believed it because they trusted the person and his integrity. I don't think there is a Walter Cronkite left.
No.
Who out there would you say now is the person you go to trust? There isn't anyone.
I think in general news, like in politics or in just hard news, it's hard to find somebody that, because it's so partisan oriented and it's so done that way. Sports to me is one of the last bastion, like the Red Barbers of the world, or I don't know. I like Bryant Gumbel. I like his show that he did for HBO. He still does for HBO. I just think he's so credible when he talks about sports.
Well, when our great Los Angeles Dodger broadcaster retired, that was the end of
Vin Scully?
Yeah, when Vin Scully, right. Because you believed him. When he said something,
but I think in
that
sports,
was gospel.
I think in sports, that's where I still feel like those people are held in such high esteem, people that are great sports broadcasters. Think about it. Like, where else?
But,
Bob Woodward, I would say.
But it's tainted a little bit because... There was a movie about him, and it was about going after Nixon. Yes, I agree, but no, it's the other one that's more.
Bernstein.
Right.
Bernstein is Woodward. I'd say to me is as close as you can get to that individual you were asking someone to name.
But who else? So Bob Woodward's a good example.
I always thought Dan Rather was that kind of guy, but he got banged up a little bit.
He got caught up. Brokaw got caught up.
Yeah, both of them. Although he wrote
Peter Jennings passed too soon.
Yeah, yes.
Right? Chet Huntley.
Huntley and Brinkley.
Brinkley grew up with them.
Yeah. Well, Brinkley I loved. Yes. Right? His Sunday morning show. That was my...
The tragedy of what's happening now is that it's like when, you get pulled into the mud with the pig, and you get all dirty, and the pig likes it. I find it hard that the things that I'm beginning to question my go-to sources anymore.
Who are your go-to sources?
Well, New York Times always was my go-to. Washington Post. I like Christian Science Monitor.
How about The Guardian?
Yeah. I try to get 3 or 4 perspectives on things, but sometimes, I'm even worrying, is this, who is, I never heard of this reporter. What's his
Jim,
angle?
When you wake up in the morning, what do you read or watch or listen to?
Oh, the very first thing I do is look at local
the
Missoulian and the Current,
right.
And again, both in an online
fashion.
I don't subscribe to the old-fashioned newspaper, not because I don't like that. I would love to have ink on my fingers every morning, but the cost is to the point I just do the online version.
Right.
Those are the first two locally. I enjoyed thoroughly the Independent.
Right.
And its opinion pieces, but they rest in peace. Nationally, the same. You just Post and Times. Pretty much that's it.
Isn't it amazing that? But then a lot of people aren't going to the original sources. They're going to their social media feed. They're going.
They got a feed every morning when I get up and hit my phone button. I got the headlines, and that pop up, and then
your Apple, your news.
You know, and it's
curated for you.
It's curated.
The word curation was never something that they talked about. Although, by the way, the New York Times is curating. They all were curating.
The problem with my curation is that I want to also read what people that have differing opinions believe.
Well, watch Fox News.
Yes, so I get some of that coming in.
You should.
So I go, what?
You should.
Yeah.
To see how they're spinning that story that you think is this way, but really they are saying it this way. Or I think what was the example when the BuzzFeed piece broke that the Fox News didn't talk about it until 8 hours later, right? And CNN.
Tell our listeners which BuzzFeed piece you're referring to.
The piece, the piece about Trump ordering to deal with Russia. What was the? I forget. See, I'm so lost with that. It was Trump ordering Cohen, right, to orchestrate.
He ordered him to
lie.
To lie, right.
Right, on the Trump Tower meetings.
Right, on the Trump Tower meetings, which it turned out, or we're not sure, but the special counsel kind of distanced himself from it and said that's not what was found in the information. And so then everybody walked away from it. But Fox originally didn't report on it for 8 hours. Okay?
They went after
and then CNN.
They just totally on.
But then they ultimately had to.
Right. They're 24/7 against the new young congresswoman from New York.
Right.
That's who they're after.
Alexandria Ocasio. Right.
Yeah.
But then the interesting thing is that the CNN, when they reported on it, didn't say this is fact, that this has not been verified.
Right.
So they did the right thing where they kept the distance.
But look at all the work we're talking about to go through. Before, you'd read the story in the paper and you believed it.
Right.
And generally, it was good to believe it because it was accurate.
And one of the worst things in the world is that term we hear every day, fake news.
Right.
That to me, what American would attack a basic First Amendment position? My head's swimming on that one. I can't.
It has to be recast by whoever gets the next mic as opinion. It's opinion news. It's not really fake. It's somebody's opinion about what's going on in most cases, or it's made up.
Cable news is thought of as fake news, or the New York Times.
I mean, if
Post.
you believe some of the independent.
Well, fake news is a term that's simply been put into play to attack anything you don't like.
Right.
That's right.
An opinion that somebody else has, or a fact that somebody else has.
A factual news story that you don't
global warming,
like.
like global warming,
right.
Climate change.
Right.
The president now is saying, made fun of the Arctic vortex by saying, "Where's all that global warming when we need it?"
Yeah, he doesn't.
You don't know whether he doesn't get it or he's making a joke about it.
He gets it. He's just using it to.
But what's shocking to me in this era is that a reliable third-party, unconnected, fact-check organization can say in the last 12 months the President of the United States lied 6,000 times. And it doesn't really change anything.
The Pinocchios.
It's so common. Every day it occurs that we're numb to it.
Well, I was shocked at one point when this was very interesting to me, and when I realized things were really going upside down. They went a chief of staff for a United States senator was questioned and related to Planned Parenthood. And the news media said your senator from Texas, said that 97% of all Planned Parenthood's funding is being used for abortion services, when in fact only 7% is being used. What do you say about that? And the chief of staff said, well, the senator's comment was not meant to be factual. You know, and you're throwing... You know,
I mean, what do you say to things like that? What do you say to someone who, explains their comments by saying they're alternative facts? I don't know what those are.
Right, alternative facts.
They're lies. Alternative.
Yeah, oh
things
yes.
Alternative to facts are untruths.
Yes.
I want to get back to Jim though for a second. We can
rant and rave about this for a long time.
We know that we can sit here and talk for 5 hours and we'll all be enjoying it. But let's get back. So writing for the Current, you're enjoying that. What else? So that's your principal media outlet right now is the Current.
And it wasn't really intended. I didn't know Martin at all. Let's do the Martin story. Martin's you need to have him on this program.
We've had him.
Oh, have you?
We
okay,
love
great. I mean, here's a fella who finally, you know, said, I'm in this corporate news structure. I don't like what's happening. That was much my story on the broadcast side. New York people who didn't relate at all to the local issues and concerns and staffing needed to cover the news.
And for our listeners, Martin Kidson was the editor at the newspaper.
One of the editors.
One of the editors, certainly one of their best writers for a long time. In any event, he just said enough of the corporate business and said, I can do something on my own. I'd often thought of that. Could someone actually do that? In my mind, it would have taken 3, 4, 5 people to do that, something along that line. He did it alone. He created this online newspaper alone.
Yep.
And only over the last few years has added staff to the organization. I started reading it from the get-go 3 years ago, January, and was just fascinated that this fellow could be doing this. So I invited him to speak to an organization. I'm the president, I'm going to make a grammatical error, president of which I'm president. Again,
what's the name of the organization?
Missoula Senior Forum.
Okay.
We meet once a week at the country club. In fact, today was our meeting this morning. And the whole point of the organization is retired individuals from the professions who don't want to do service work and raise money and the sorts of things that, the Lions Club and various organizations do. But they do want to get together for, coffee and conversation and hear an interesting speaker each week. That's the premise. We have no rules, no anything. So I invited Martin to talk to the group and met him for the first time in March 3 years ago, and was just absolutely taken by him. And I emailed him later and said, well, is there anything I can do to help you out? I've been digging into old newspapers for years. Would you like to maybe have some of that as content for your new online news organization? He said, well, sure. And that's the way it began.
It's 3 years too.
3 years later, it's still going.
And it's a popular thing, part of the paper.
Harmon's Histories.
Harmon's History, but it is popular. I was immediately attracted to Lisa Vacchio, who is the publisher, a friend of mine. She posted it on her Facebook, which is where social media is so valuable. I read it, and I looked at it, and I sent it to Arnie. I said, this is great. I said,
well, I've been reading it.
Yeah, you've been reading it.
But it didn't dawn on me that we should have Jim come on the show.
But it's good because again, back to the old thing, the past informs the present. Let's take a quick break. We'll have our final words with Jim Harmon right after this. All right, we are back with Jim Harmon.
So, Jim, are you open to people who have story ideas that they want you to research about the history of Missoula that might lead to an online article?
Oh, absolutely. I just like the club I mentioned, I have no rules either. I have no
So how would somebody get a hold of you?
It's right there on the current location. It's Harmon's Histories at gmail.com.
Harmon's Histories at gmail.com. The publication is the Missoula Current.
The MissoulaCurrent.com.
Right. And that's where they find the publication.
That's where they find the online-only publication that Martin's done. What do you have in store for your next column?
Well, again, tying in with the Current, I noticed that our Ravalli County attorney and a representative of the Police Chiefs and Police Officers Association in the state of Montana went before the state legislature within the last week. And a very worthwhile proposal, a piece of legislation to update the intimidation law to reflect social media, specifically in Ravalli County in the last week alone or so. I don't know, 3 or 4 threats to schools via social media.
Somebody was arrested,
like that.
in fact, for that in Stevensville.
Exactly. So they went to the legislature, but in their presentation to the legislature, they used a phrase that's exactly 100 years old come March. They said, "You can't yell fire in a crowded theater." Well, that was a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes on the Supreme Court in 100 years ago come March, so 1919. But that's not a law.
No.
That was an aside he wrote to give you some concept that there are limitations that can be placed on the First Amendment.
First Amendment, right.
But it wasn't a statement of fact. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. There's no such law on the books. You can do that. But historically, that said it all for that period, because that was a period of ramshackle construction, wood materials and worse, very flammable materials, no fire codes, no anything.
The whole cities could burn down like
So
San
in
Francisco.
New York on December 30th, the Christmas holiday ending in 1919, Iroquois Theater, brand new, state-of-the-art for the time theater, caught fire. 600 plus people died in the stampede to get out of the place, and that was the reference because that was such an issue at the time. Now, zip forward 100 years, you have modern construction, fire codes, emergency escapes, etc., so that any theater doesn't face that problem today. But again, they're making a reference to something that isn't law, was never law. In fact, the case involved had nothing to do with fires or theaters. It had to do with the Espionage Act and someone who was a socialist who at the time was wanting to pass out literature saying, hey, eligible young men, please resist the draft, World War I. And so all of this was the background, the history behind Don't Yell Fire in a Crowded Theater, which both these contemporary fellows, one the county attorney of Ravalli County, used in their arguments before the 2019 legislature.
And if it wasn't for you, no one else would have researched this, and they would have taken it for fact. So we need
context is
important.
Context is everything. Mm-hmm. It's amazing. It's actually right. You're doing the research to give the context as to why this is and how it doesn't relate.
And I totally agree with Bill Fulbright, the county attorney, who's a wonderful fellow doing his best to update law, etc. But it just struck me, why are you using that hackneyed phrase that really didn't relate?
He didn't understand the context.
As a fact of law.
Yeah.
Well, we could go on for hours.
We're going to have you back, Jim. We got to have you back
because we like this more than maybe our listeners.
We'll give you subjects that we want to cover.
And there you go.
That's what we should do.
Exactly.
All right.
Good point.
All right. Well, Arnie, I will see you next week. Jim, it was nice to meet you.
Jim,
Thank you.
My pleasure. See you next week, Scott.
All right. See you then, Arnie. Thank you for listening to What Do You Know?
I can't wait for the next show, Scott.
I'm excited too, Arnie. If you'd like to suggest a guest, send me an email at scottrichmond@townsquaremedia.com. We'll see you next week. And thanks for listening to Newstalk KGVO,